It's your Carib Money Report for this week in May 2025. I am Kimberly Ramkalawan. Coming up, we hear Barbados Central Bank Governor giving its projections for its economy, while we see how investment in a packaging company in Jamaica is signaling a strong environment for potential investors. Plus, we look at the original meaning of CARIFTA. Our show starts in less than a minute. Initial forecast figures given for economies at the start of the year are all being revisited following the changes in the economic climate arising from the newest trade impositions. One such country taking a look at the weathering is Barbados. Barbados is downgrading its growth projections for 2025 amid inflationary impacts the trade wars are having on its economy. Nevertheless, its central bank is positive this will rebound later on in the year. Its governor, Dr. Kevin Greenidge, explained during the CBB's economic review this week.
The global economy, particularly U.S. economy, which are our number one trading partner, also reflected the spin-off effects that we expect will come perhaps through the tourism arm impacting our economy. We originally had our growth at 3%, we're down to 2.7%, but we expect it to come back up and set around 3%. These are a balance, upside risk, downside risk. Now, what is going to support that?
However, the bank remains optimistic, citing international reserves currently at $3.4 billion, or 32.4 weeks of import cover, while it also notes that unemployment has also declined to 7.1%.
Grow. When you consider the inflation effects, the value of that, about $4 billion compared to 3.8, so continued expansion since 2019. The latest data we have for unemployment rates is 7.1. That's end of September 2024. When we actually look at that September data, it shows 9,000 more persons employed, and the labor force expanding by 7,900 persons. At the end of March 2024, March this year, we had 32.4 weeks of import cover. In terms of volume, that's $3.4 billion in reserves. Quite a good buffer, as you know, in this current volatile environment. What drove that? Majority is driven by, again, tourism earnings, net tourism receipts.
St. Kitts and Nevis is leading a call for blended financing to be unlocked, along with concessional grants scaled up, as small islands in the region must tackle the effects of climate change. This as it represented the Caribbean this week at the BRS conventions currently underway in Geneva, Switzerland.
We call for leveraging green bonds and sustainability-linked bonds to co-finance circular economy startups, such as recycling systems for plastics and e-waste. Prioritize capacity building and technology transfer. Catalyze private sector innovation. Extended producer responsibility schemes for packaging and electronics, paired with research and development incentives for clean tech, can mirror UNIDO's chemical leasing model. And by de-risking green investments, we harness private sector expertise for scalable solutions. Excellencies, SIDS cannot shoulder this burden alone.
At the center of their latest statements, it urged the World Bank to remove its labels such as high income from developing states if it is to access its grants.
St. Kitts and Nevis is working to transform our nation through our sustainable island state agenda, a people-centered framework tackling interconnected crises, biodiversity collapse, plastic pollution, and climate change. These threats amplify risks to food security, public health, and national stability, demanding urgent action and global solidarity. Yet, outdated metrics like the World Bank's high-income label obscures persistent vulnerabilities like extreme climate vulnerability and the toxic burden of imported pollution, and skews access to concessional financing.
The BRS conventions are international environmental treaties responsible for the management of hazardous chemicals and waste. The high-level forum is a meeting point where nations signed on to the treaties can further engage in handling environmental challenges such as pollution and climate change. The move to position Jamaica as a top industrial destination for investment was underscored by Prime Minister Andrew Holness, even as he opened a $2 billion Jamaican dollar packaging plant. His reasoning for attracting investors: improved regulatory frameworks and lowered energy cost, a promise that comes after the recent signings of PPPs with Wigtown Energy and Centerra Solar Energy.
Trinidad has the energy advantage over us because we don't have oil. But Singapore doesn't have oil either. And what they have managed to do there is to improve the resources in their people, in their regulatory environment, in the efficiency of their economy, in the security of their society. And that's what we are doing here. We are going to have to take some profound measures to ensure that your energy costs are competitive, if not less than others in our region. We are going to make some bold moves as it relates to energy. So stay tuned for that.
Part of the plan to resuscitate special economic zones with the much needed infrastructure.
So we are having heavy industrial and light industrial manufacturing re-emerging. And the government is supporting this. We're supporting this by creating special economic zones, making lands available, and building infrastructure.
Jamaican packaging celebrates 70 years this year, while the investment reflects a demand for more locally corrugated packaging.
The new facility has increased JPI's production capacity by some 250%.
This investment in a facility that represents the next era for JPI and packaging in Jamaica. It was influenced by impressive growth, yes, but more importantly, by a clear understanding of the critical need for more locally produced, high-quality corrugated packaging to truly support Jamaica's range of sectors.
In some impactful international business news, MasterCard has announced plans to incorporate AI into your shopping plans, launching its agentic payments program. MasterCard Agent Pay integrates AI to revolutionize commerce with the assurance to deliver smarter, more secure and more personal payment experiences to consumers, merchants, and issuers. The program collaborates with Microsoft to scale agentic commerce, with plans for other leading AI platforms to follow. But how does it work? MasterCard Agent Pay says it will enhance generative AI conversations for people and businesses alike by integrating trusted, seamless payments experiences into the tailored recommendations and insights already provided on conversational platforms. Its Chief Product Officer, Jean Lambert, describes as transforming the way the world pays for the better by anticipating consumer needs on the horizon. MasterCard assures that consumers will have complete control over what the agent is allowed to purchase on their behalf, ensuring that the payments they make are securely authorized and identified. Here's some of the financial headlines making the rounds in the region this week. We take a break now. When we return, we discuss Carib CBI programs with leadership consultant and entrepreneur Nigel Matthew.
We want you to advertise with us. Join us as the premier business magazine and news outlet covering the Caribbean. Contact us today at 868-783-5094.
Welcome back. In our last episode, we covered how several Caribbean leaders were defending their engagement with citizen by investment programs. This week, news broke of Malta's fallout with the EU over their laws pertaining to CBI. To explain just how and what Caribbean nations need to do to protect their programs is Nigel Matthew. We now join him via Zoom. Good day. We are now joined with Nigel Matthews, leadership consultant and entrepreneur. Welcome to Carib Money Report. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Kimberly, and it's a pleasure to be on your program, the Carib Money Report online program.
Now, in recent weeks, the Citizen by Investment program, one which many Caribbean countries engage in, has come under some serious scrutiny from the European Union, with threats to say that visa-free travel will be revoked unless something is done legislatively to reduce these undesirables misusing their visas. I mean, such a word undesirables. Tell me what more can be done by Caribbean islands to prevent such drastic moves, and is there enough time to comply to save their reputations?
Well, in terms of the Caribbean jurisdictions that involve the CBI program, Citizenship by Investment, yes, there are legislation, but what the EU is focusing on is the robustness of those legislation to protect people who may fraudulently want to come into the country to sort of escape their legal jurisdiction in their particular country, because we can talk about fraud, illicit activities, and money laundering. So in terms of the EU imposing such restriction, it will definitely impact the citizens of those organizations in terms of wishing to travel to the EU, and of course, by extension, the costs associated with obtaining those visas. Because there's always a view and an inherent risk that CBI by investment is inherently risky in terms of attracting the undesirables into your country by virtue of buying their citizenship.
The Citizen by Investment program is one where many Caribbean islands, their economies depend on, especially with climate change happening and having to meet these sustainable development goals as outlined by the UN. Do you have any idea of what percentage of revenues these programs make up for such economies?
Yeah, these economies, in terms of that, who use that, especially countries like Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica is a very dominant one, St. Kitts, and St. Lucia as well, you find that it ranges between 30 and 60% of GDP, which is a huge amount in terms of attracting those type of investments. And these economies are primarily, let's say, agriculture in nature, and they try to export. But of course, that exporting of those goods and services may not be sufficient to really see about the bridges, the infrastructure, the telecommunication in those particular jurisdictions. Hence the reason for some form of diversification of income by the CBI. So it is somewhat reliant on what has happened too, is because of the tariff situation all over the world now, you find that there will be more pressure for organizations, for those countries to go heavily into CBI because they need to see about the people, and that is one of the avenues to really generate money. But of course, commensurate with that, there are illicit issues with those type of programs.
Now, with the EU going in this direction, I mean, how do you see this affecting our funding? A lot of our funding also comes from the European Union in this region. How would you see this affecting a lot of the developmental programs that are in place in such countries?
Right. So those programs, the EU will definitely impose more tighter regulations in order to sort of look at the legislation that sort of governs the CBI programs. And if the countries cannot come up to those things, or if the people are using those territories within the Caribbean as a gateway to enter those other European countries, then that will definitely be an issue for those particular jurisdictions. So to me, there are two choices. It's either you strengthen your legislative framework to have more check-ins, to really screen these applicants, both not only the applicants and the family, but also the associates. Because once we do some sort of check-in, you find that things might pop up. So you find that in terms of the laws now, we have what we call Global Forum, Economic for OECD requirements. Countries must comply with common reporting standards because people use CBI as a way to evade taxes, which is illegal. And part of those mutual administrative assistance and tax matters acts, which we have all invoked in all jurisdictions, we now have to report those people who belong to other countries in terms of who try to evade taxes. That will be a definitely impact on those countries. The compliance matters for those are quite heavy. So it's either you do it or you may have to be removed from those subsidies and those sort of privileges that those countries once enjoyed.
Do you have any idea what kind of legislation some of these countries have currently that would work in essence? I mean, in Trinidad and Tobago, we have the Trinidad and Tobago Securities Commission, and what kind of jurisdiction do these islands have, and what would they need to put in place to make it more stringent, to be a little more due diligent in dissuading these persons who would bring disrepute to the program?
Right. So you find that one of the downfalls in this program definitely would have been the screening mechanism. So you find that you have now to comply. We now have to comply with GDPR, general data protection regulations, so that would be imposed. We now have ESG, economic, social, and governance, so that will also be imposed. And as I mentioned before, we have new acts concerning Global Forum, common reporting standards. And commensurate with that is what we call mutual administrative assistance on tax matters. So countries must impose these conditionalities. And if there is anything in terms of people having accounts in financial institutions, they have to report to their competent authority. The competent authority in most jurisdictions would be what we call inland revenue, the tax revenue authority, and try to get that information to the other jurisdictions. Without doing that, and of course, it's not a matter of saying, okay, you have those laws, but of course, those laws have to be tested. Those laws have to go through what we call mutual evaluations, which would be done by our own FATF regional body in the Caribbean, what we call CFATF, Caribbean Financial Action Task Force. So there's a whole program approach in terms of coming up to and satisfying international standards so that at least you can have that relationship with the European countries and even countries in North America as well.
Do you see the visa restrictions fair to these islands by chance? Or it feels like Peter is paying for Paul here.
Yeah, definitely. It is not fair because at the same time, remember, these countries' GDP is sometimes a bit low. So imposing additional, let's say, fees in terms of, visa requirement, and of course, as you know, those fees are not refundable. So that could put a damper in terms of the trade relationship between our local small islands in the Caribbean and, of course, the European Union. But, of course, the European Union now is protecting its borders because you find that illicit activities, money launderers, people involved in crime, use these CBI programs to, let's say, come through the back door into these European countries. And of course, by extension, they have a right to protect their borders. So unless we, in terms of the Caribbean, strengthen our administrative process, strengthen our screening so that we can sanction those people who found to be unwanted or breaching the conditionalities as imposed within the CBI program. We have had issues with that in the Caribbean, whereby some, those people, passports have been revoked, which I think is a good thing. So that revocation means that there is something that is happening, some sort of monitoring, some form of due diligence to prevent, people coming in and, of course, putting a damper on those countries.
Now, sometimes there's this notion that is seen that the bar is being constantly raised for Caribbean islands, and it comes across as being undue and unjust. Do you agree with this, or do you think times are changing and we need to come up to par when it comes to technology and what is being done by these external bodies wishing to enter our territories?
Yeah, there seems to be a sort of a disadvantage to small economies. And of course, those sentiments have already been echoed by Nigel Matthew, the Prime Minister of Barbados, who is now the chair of CARIFTA. In terms of the draconian type of legislation, especially when we're looking at money laundering, financing of terrorism, and proliferation of financing as well, why do countries in the Caribbean who have not really demonstrated, a prevalence of money laundering have to impose and go through all these set of conditionalities to satisfy a particular law? But on the same time, yes, we have to protect our borders. Yes, we have to protect our people. And then we are not developed as many countries. So you find that imposing costs, because all these things are costly to administer, you find that you have less money for your infrastructure, for your telecommunication, for your social programs. So that countries now are forced to go into these CBI programs as a form of diversification, as a form of earning money to satisfy your people. So that maybe Nigel Matthew is now the head of CARICOM, maybe more international representation can be made to have a sort of a tiered system with respect to legislative, so that we in the Caribbean will not be too overly penalized, should be found not to be compliant with those international statutes.
Is there any kind of lobbying that Caribbean islands, Caribbean nations can participate in or do before the EU with getting their own nations, the nations within the Schengen area, to probably strengthen their laws to prevent these things, because it's affecting them? I mean, we're here, but is there something that they could do? And if we can lobby for them to do something on their end, prevent such things from happening? Yeah,
I strongly believe that, we in the CARICOM, we have to hold tight, we have to be together. Because the last thing you want is individual countries, going off on their own tangent and, trying to sort of make their own representation. So it must be a Caribbean-wide representation. They must allow or try for the EU and those other larger developed countries to understand the uniqueness and the challenges we face in small economies in the Caribbean, and have some sort of leveraging, have some sort of, as I said, maybe a 2-tier or 3-tier system, so we can comply, but we cannot comply by incurring too much cost. And of course, we have an issue with money. So we can be successful, but it must be coordinated. It must be 100% CARICOM initiative approaching the EU or approaching North America, as the case be. And if you can recall, before, in the Caribbean countries, in terms of our exports, we enjoy what we call preferential treatments for our exports in terms of our provision, our banana, our cassava, dasheen, and all those things. Those things are not really given anymore, right? And on top of that, our exports now are subject to tariffs. So our exports are very expensive. So if our exports are expensive, then people may not import from the Caribbean. If they're not importing from the Caribbean, then definitely there will be an issue with income and our ability to sustain our livelihood and our standard of living. So you find that going back again, the CBI seems to be a way out, but of course, to really have the program going without imposing other restrictions, like imposing, the visa restrictions, that could put a damper on our economy. So the solution to me is a robust, coordinated, 100% on board in terms of the CARICOM nations.
Do you think it's possible and we have the time to comply with before the EU makes their final decision?
I think so. We have had very good representation from CARICOM. I know that I just hear, of course, she is the head of CARICOM, Mia Motley, and she has been very vocal on these international matters. So you find that you may have a bit more teeth in terms of letting our voice be heard, and more so letting those European countries understand the challenges and the uniqueness of our small island state within CARICOM. I guess most of these things, or some of these things are, to me, a lack of understanding. They treat all as the same, and we are not the same, okay? We have beautiful islands, we have good industries, we have tourism, and we know European people would want to come to these islands. So that we don't want that to stop, because that is really increasing our production, our GDP, as the case may be. So I'm hopeful that with proper representation from the CARICOM level, we can see a somewhat of easing up of those conditions and those rules and those regulations, because we are into the global scene. As I said, we have to comply with GDPR, ESG, common reporting standards. All these things are very costly. And to impose more restrictions, to me, it would be a disadvantage to us here in the Caribbean.
Thank you very much, Mr. Matthews, for joining us today. We take a short break now. Up next, your Market Trends Report.
We want you to advertise with us. Join us as the premier business magazine and news outlet covering the Caribbean. Contact us today at 868-783-5094.
Welcome back. Jamaican company Separate has announced plans to take a bigger chunk of Trinidadian-based AS Brighton, a move that could further regional history in the world of transactions. It's now time for Market Trends. Jamaican-owned distribution company Separate has announced plans to seek a further takeover of TT-based AS Brighton and Sons Holdings. The move comes after it first moved on Trinidadian distribution firm back in 2022, which made waves in the region as one of the largest transactions, with its enhanced group earning combined revenues in excess of $500 million. Separate made the announcement via the Jamaican Stock Exchange this week, sharing its intention to acquire over $447 million ordinary shares of its subsidiary A.S. Bryden and Sons Holdings Limited, representing 29.85% of A.S. Bryden's outstanding shares. The offer price payable to ASBH shareholders that accept the offer is newly issued ordinary shares in separate at a rate of 396.43 ordinary shares in separate per 1,000 ordinary shares of ASBH. Unless extended, the offer period will expire on June 5th. Separate says since its takeover of A.S. Bryden, the TT-based firm has been able to achieve greater integration and operational efficiency, with operations expanding in its premium beverage distribution system in Barbados, Jamaica, and St. Lucia. Moving to other stock market performers. The Eastern Caribbean Securities Exchange market recorded a volume of 2,079 shares, valued at 21,201 EC dollars traded this week. Overall, a sum of 4 securities were traded, in which 1 advanced by 7.18% and 3 remained unchanged. The security that advanced was Bank of St. Vincent and the Grenadines Limited, with a total of 1,907 shares traded for the week. The Barbados Stock Exchange reported an amount of 7,696 shares, valued at 14,936 Barbadian dollars, traded on a regular market for the week ending May 2nd. The top 3 securities traded were Insurance Corporation of Barbados Limited, capturing almost 68% of the market with 5,225 shares, Epley Caribbean Property SEC Value Fund at 1,327, and Goddard Enterprises Limited with 833 shares. A total of 2 securities advanced, 1 declined, and 22 traded firm. The Trinidad and Tobago Stock Exchange reported a volume of 18,963 put-through transactions, valued at 101,489 TT dollars for this week. Market indices saw mostly declines ranging from 0.4% to 0.61%, with increases in one index by 0.29%. A total of 10 securities advanced, with LJ Williams Limited increasing the highest by 11.11% and Whitco by 7.77%. There were declines in 10 securities, in which TCL and Guardian Holdings Limited fell the most by 6.05% and 4.36% respectively. Overall, 6 stocks traded firm. Moving across to Jamaica, where its stock exchange recorded 68,921,426 stocks traded, valued at 531,272,130 Jamaican dollars for this week ending May 2nd. Radio Jamaica Limited joined the top 3 securities traded this week. A volume of 64 stocks were traded for the week. There were advances in 37 securities, in which 138 Student Living Jamaica Limited Variable Preference and A.S. Bryden and Sons Holdings Limited rose the highest by 26.24% and 18.23% respectively. A sum of 21 stocks declined, in which Margaritaville Turks Limited decreased the most by 30.18%, as well as Stanley Motor Limited ordinary shares by 14.74%. Overall, 6 stocks traded firm. A slow start in May for some on our regional markets. Carib Money Report takes a break at this time. When we return, we go back to May 1968.
We want you to advertise with us. Join us as the premier business magazine and news outlet covering the Caribbean. Contact us today at 868-783-5094.
Welcome back. Our This Week in History features the coming together of the islands in the face of international trade. Before CARICOM, there was CARIFTA, the Caribbean Free Trade Association, and though it was founded in 1965, it would only come into effect on May 1st, 1968, after the dissolution of the West Indies Federation in 1962. Signatories were Antigua, Barbados, Ghana, and Trinidad and Tobago, with the aim of simply fostering trade, diversifying economies, and promoting balanced development within the region. Later on in the year, Dominica, Grenada, St. Kitts, Nevis, Anguilla, St. Lucia and St. Vincent and the Grenadines would sign on, followed by Montserrat and Jamaica, with Belize, then British Honduras, in 1971 joining the association. Their commonality, having all recently gained independence, the inspiration to give their voices a united presence on the international trade front. Effective May 1st, CARIFTA served basically to remove all tariffs on trade among the member countries, subject to certain exceptions. While the aim was to provide free trade, the agreement sought to ensure that the benefits of free trade were equitably distributed, all while promoting industrial development in the less developed countries' LDCs. Because of CARIFTA, there was an increase in trade among the islands and an expansion of business from North Caribbean states to Eastern Caribbean states, including Belize. And while it was initially said to be limited to agriculture, there was a shift in manufactured goods as well. A diversity of goods was traded, causing a boost in external markets, while intra-CARIFTA imports rose from 95 million EC dollars in 1968 to 300 million EC in 1973. However, in 1973, CARIFTA became superseded by the Caribbean Community CARICOM, following a decision at the 7th Heads of Government Conference in October 1972. Today, while the abbreviation CARIFTA is synonymous with sports in the region, it also serves as a reminder of the coming together of the Caribbean nations. CARIFTA leading into CARICOM, a history lesson I wish I understood back in my school days. Stay with us.
We want you to advertise with us. Join us as the premier business magazine and news outlet covering the Caribbean. Contact us today at 868-783-5094.
Well, this is how we end this week's show. I am Kimberly Ram Calawan. Join us next week for another Carib Money Report.